there, welcome back. Welcome to Module 7 Volatility Studies. In this video, we're going to be talking about what are volatility studies. We're going to discuss some different types of volatility studies. We'll show you details about selected ones, which in this case we're going to go into the Bollinger Bands and the Keltner channels. And then we'll talk about making trading decisions based on these volatility studies. And we'll actually finish out by combining both of them together into a new hybrid study. Up to this point, we've been placing emphasis through studies like oscillators, whether the movement of price is overbought or oversold. As we've often seen, price does not just stop and reverse because it's hit an overbought or oversold extreme. It tends to keep on going in terms of momentum if we have a very strong trend. In this module, I'd like to introduce you to the terms of expansion and contraction as they relate to the price movement. Prices expand their range through trend, and then they move to contract their range through consolidation. So for example, we often see this where we have a trend that expands the range, and then we move into consolidation, or it contracts the range. So range expansion moves into range contraction, where we see smaller movements in compression of the range. And then the exact converse occurs, is that we see range contraction move into range expansion once again. So start to notice this on your charts. Price is continually moving between the two states of range expansion to range contraction, and then back and forth again. So what is a volatility study then? It's going to help us define whether the price is in range expansion or range contraction. And then when in one of those modes has it gone too far. So sometimes we'll see range expansion go a little bit too far, a little bit too fast. And conversely, we'll also see range contraction go on for a little too long and the volatility get a little too quiet. So think of this price movement around a normal distribution. So volatility studies will help us understand when the price movement has gone too far relative to other occurrences. So if normally we see price movement stay within this range, so the meat of the bell curve here, we're going to see movements that occur up here where we have huge movements in range or huge trends. And then we'll have the exact opposite over here when we have literally no trend whatsoever. So we will see fat tails here. We'll see extremes when it comes to volatility, whereas most of the occurrences will kind of fit very neatly within the center of the bell curve. So again, range expansion, in this case, you can see this range expansion trend. This is always going to lead to range contraction sooner or later. And then they go back and forth and back and forth. We can even see smaller examples of this. From this range contraction, we had range expansion to the downside that led into range contraction on a smaller time frame. And we see this just occurring again and again, range expansion leading to range contraction, which leads to range expansion again. While overbought and oversold are one concept that's been around for quite a while, these days, typically, I'm more using range expansion and range contraction. They're more advanced concepts. Just to highlight this point one more time, volatility studies can help us not only see whether the price is in expansion or contraction, but also when those states have gone a little too far. Now we have different types of these volatility studies. Most volatility studies will surround the price by an envelope, and we'll see these in just a minute here. The envelope will center itself based on a moving average of the price. So by seeing this envelope, we'll get a sense as to whether the price is showing an extreme expansion or a contraction in price range. We'll look at two different volatility studies. As we look at each study, we'll discuss trading applications for each one of them. After we've looked at them individually, we'll look at using them together. Now, normally you don't have to spend very much time hanging around charts or analysis or trading before you eventually hear the name of John Bollinger and his Bollinger Bands. Again, it's a technical analysis tool, and in this case, what we're going to be looking at is we will see that his tool uses a 20-period moving average, and around that 20-period moving average, we're going to be charting price movement in standard deviations. So at that given time, what would be plus and minus 2 standard deviations of price movement from that specific point in time. And what this creates is an envelope of price movement like this. So the bands will get fat and the bands will get skinny around places where a standard deviation represents a much smaller standard of movement. So here we go on TradingView. Again, a very typical Bollinger Band configuration. The one that will come default from the factory here is going to be a length of 20 period moving average. Usually it's a simple moving average because the standard deviation calculation is done through simple. And it's going to be based on the closing price, 2 standard deviations. This is what you're going to see just about everywhere. So notice how well the price tends to stay within the bands here. These are the Bollinger Bands. You can see if you look carefully here in the center, there's the 20 period moving average. And notice how well the price tends to stay within here. Now, something else you can also see is this is a Bollinger Squeeze. This is a place where the standard deviations, plus minus 2 standard deviations, actually represents a very small number because basically what's been happening over that 20 periods of past data is very little trending. So when we have large trends, we're going to see the bands expand to be very, very wide because the standard deviation of price movement, plus minus 2, is at that point very large. And then you can see what happens during periods like this where the price is essentially going nowhere. Very little volatility, very little price movement. We have the bands squeezing together one more time. So you can start to see this concept of range contraction leads to range expansion, which leads to more range contraction at a much larger time frame, which leads to range expansion again, and that leads to contraction, and it just goes back and forth. But what we'll use the bands for is to identify extremes in price movement. So you can see an extreme in price movement anytime the price is outside of the bands. Normally when it goes outside of the bands, it's going to get hauled back inside because the price has come too far in too short a time frame. Too far, too fast. So again, we can see the bands coming out here, and there's that nice signal with big volume that shows kind of a selling exhaustion at that point. And the price actually goes from the lower Bollinger Band all the way up to the top Bollinger Band. So those are great signals they're always going to be looking for. Some keys to using the Bollinger Bands is that, remember, everything works best in the direction of the major trend. So if we have a major trend working to the upside, what we're going to look for is when the bands or the price hits the bands and goes outside of the bands to the downside. That's going to be the signal that we kind of want to see, because if the price is pulled back too far too fast to the downside, we're going to get that slingshot type movement back up to the upside. And we can see exactly the opposite thing if the price is moving overall to the downside. Anything that pops outside of the upper Bollinger Band is very likely to get sold back down again. Remember that a closing price outside the bands means that the price has moved 2 standard deviations in price movement, or at least 2, if it's outside of the bands, and has likely come too far too fast. The envelope will widen out during periods of large volatility, and it will narrow down in quiet volatility. It's going to bounce back and forth between those 2 extremes. Range expansion, which creates wide bands, will lead to range contraction, and they will narrow down again, normally into a squeeze. So watch for that Bollinger Squeeze during low volatility, because that means the price is just about to move again. The next volatility study is called the Keltner channels, and they're named after Chester W. Keltner. Unfortunately, we don't have his picture here. He passed away some time ago, but his work was done back in the 1960s, so this study has been around for quite some time. So instead of plotting an envelope based on standard deviations, like as in the Bollinger Bands, we're going to plot these envelopes based on ATR, or average true range. So for any particular day, there's a range to that candlestick or that bar, right? There's a range to the price movement, and we can have small days, we can have very large days of price movement. And so the larger that the ATR is, the larger that the common range is, the wider the bands are going to be, as we'll see with the Keltner channels. Now, there's many different ways that you can use the Keltner channels. The typical setup that I like to use here is just based on a 20-period moving average with a 1.5 multiplier, just using it simple, and we'll see why in a minute because we want to keep it simple. And we're going to base the bands on true range. Again, you can base the bands on just about any type of multiplier that you want to. Lately, though, it's become very, very common to base the distance from the center moving average to the upper and lower bands based on that ATR, or average true range. Now, the Keltner channels are a little bit different. What you'll notice is, depending on how we want to set these things up, but you'll notice that the price spends more of its time outside of the envelope than it did with the Bollinger Bands. It's very common to see this running outside of the Keltner channels for quite some distance. So as a result, we don't care that much about the price being outside of the Keltner channels as we did the Bollinger Bands. As a result of that, what I typically will use this study for, I use it as an entry filter. So in other words, if we have an uptrend, in place, I will use this as an entry filter, and I will look to take an entry on the area between the mid to lower Keltner channel. So again, in an uptrend, I will look for the entry at the mid to lower Keltner channel on an uptrend. If we were entering on a downtrend, we would look for the entry to be somewhere between the mid to upper Keltner channel. So again, that's the entry as an entry filter. That's the use as an entry filter. Now, what I will also do with the Keltner channel is I will sometimes display these on my charts with shorter time frame trades, and I will use this as a dynamic stop level. So in other words, if the price is heading to the upside like this, you want to capture as much of that value as possible. You want to give it room to breathe, and you don't want to get too tight of a stop and get stopped out somewhere down here and miss out on this whole big chunk of movement. So I will use the Keltner channels as more of a dynamic stop. So I'll keep my stop below the lower Keltner channel. And that will be on a closing basis for that candlestick. If I say my stop is down there, it may just be a mental stop and not actually an order in with the exchange. The keys to using the Keltner channels is, again, this is going to show a slightly different view of volatility than the Bollinger Bands. I use this more of as a utility study for trade entry and for dynamic stop management. Now here's the neat thing. We can also combine the Keltners with the Bollinger Bands to create this hybrid study that you'll hear referred to out in the trading world as the squeeze indicator. So the conditions that we want to look for here is when the Bollinger Bands, and I've changed the color of the Bollinger Bands to be the hot pink here, and the Keltner channels are going to be in the cyan blue. So the light blue are the Keltner channels. Now, when the Bollinger Bands are actually inside of the Keltner channels, this is where we get some very interesting movement. This signifies a super, super quiet market. So we have this condition over here. We have a super quiet market right there. This is right before, and actually we have it once again right there as well too. So we have this super quiet market here. Range contraction leads to range expansion, does it not? Okay, we also had this condition right there for a very brief period of time. Range expansion leads to range contraction. So this identifies very, very quiet periods that are just about to, as they say, bust a move. So you can either do this just through the old school way of just applying the Bollinger Bands and the Keltner channels and then just look for periods where the Bollinger Bands are inside of the Keltner channels, or there are various adaptations through private and public means where people have actually created these or combined these into one indicator. So again, the Bollinger Bands inside of the Keltner channels signify super quiet conditions that normally occur directly before a big, big move. Get used to thinking about range expansion and range contraction on your charts. It's a new way of thinking, and I think is more accurate in today's markets. Volatility studies are a great way to spot these extremes and set up high probability trades. That is it for Module 7 in Volatility Studies. In Module 8, we are going to cover studies that focus on the trend characteristics of the price, and these are some of my favorite. We'll see you there.